Welcome to the Dickinson College Expert Show, where we connect you with scholars and insight from Dickinson College. I'm Craig Lane. Thanks so much for joining us. With us today is Assistant Professor of History Say Burgin. Professor Burgin, thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure.
All right. So we'll start by talking about what you research and what you teach. Can you give us just a quick overview?
Sure. So I am a 20th century historian of the United States, and I tend to specialize in African American and social movement history. So I teach a lot of classes on popular social movements in the 20th century, right? So the women's liberation movement, civil rights movement. But then I also teach broader classes on modern African American history, histories of institutional racism in the U.S., topics like that.
Right. So topics that are very appropriate for today's political and social climate then, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you are the author of a new book. The book is called Organizing Our Own, The White Fight for Black Power in Detroit. And so this is just out from NYU Press. Can you tell us about why you chose to write this book?
So the book has a lot of different origin stories, but the Dickinson origin story for it comes from teaching about the Black Power movement here at Dickinson and teaching groups of students who were really active here on campus and who were seeing parallels between how the Black Power movement got demonized in the 1960s and 70s and how the movement for Black lives was getting demonized in the 2010s and the 2020s. So the students were really pushing me to sort of do something in a way about the demonization of the Black Power movement as anti-white. And so that's the sort of Dickinson origin story of the book.
That's fascinating. So history echoing or rhyming, right? But you found something really interesting, which was that there's a perception that the Black Power movement kicked white people out of the civil rights struggle in the 60s, but that's actually not the case.
Yeah, so for a lot of different reasons, there was this myth that evolved around the Black Power movement in the 60s and 70s that said basically it boiled down to being violent and kicking white people out of the movement, right? So Black Power has kind of long been seen as this closing ranks and telling white people to kind of go away. But actually, my big argument is that that isn't what Black Power was doing, that it had this very clear mandate for white America. And that mandate wasn't, hey, go away. It was, we have a different task that we'd like you to do. What we would like you to do is organize in your own white communities against racism there. And I found that there was a whole critical mass, a huge swath and cross-section of white people in Detroit specifically that answered that call and tried to do just that.
So Detroit is a good marker. You were able to do a lot of oral history, a lot of research too in the library there. Tell us about that.
So I mostly spent a lot of time in the Reuther Library, which is at Wayne State University in Detroit. There's all kinds of collections there from sort of activist lawyers like Ken Cockrell, from big important Black Power groups like the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. But then also all of these white people had their stories kind of hidden in plain sight at the Reuther. And they had been active by trying to raise the alarm on police brutality, by creating affirmative action programs, by organizing people in their churches and synagogues, right? Things like that. But then the history of the white fight for Black Power was also in plain sight because all of these people are still living and they were dying to tell their stories about it. So it was really fun to get to talk to them.
Wow. So a lot of time sitting with the folks who lived it, right?
Yeah.
Was that revealing in ways that you didn't expect to be?
Yeah, I think, I have long been practicing oral history and I teach oral history here, but it always surprises me because you sit down with somebody and you ask them to tell you about their life and they're going to tell you about their life, right? So they tell you about things you didn't really ask about, maybe didn't need to know, but then you also hear these really, really incredible stories of people who just did really brave things and people who just tried everything they could, right? Letters to the editor, lobbying Congress, direct action protest, setting up their own freedom schools in the suburbs, right? They just tried this range of things. And without talking to them directly, I just wouldn't have gotten near the amount of rich detail that I did in the book.
So it sounds to me like this was an ask from the African-American civil rights leaders to say, we want you to do this in parallel, right? So you mentioned the suburbs. So they're doing these organizing campaigns alongside with the same goal, That's pretty much the idea of parallel organizing.
Yeah. So, and that when they sort of start out in the Detroit side of the story, at least, these black and white groups are working in parallel, but with a really close relationship. And so, some of times the black-led groups are giving very specific instructions to the white-led groups, right? So, in 1967, as many people will know, Detroit had this really enormous uprising that happened, and there was a whole lot of violence. Enacted by the state against Black people in the city. And Black leaders specifically asked white people to go and gather those stories, right? And try to seek justice for those people. So there was really specific sets of direction sometimes early on. And then as time went on, the groups tended to get more independent from each other, but they still worked in parallel.
So that's fascinating. So it wasn't really a separation. They were still coordinating in many ways. This is what interests us now about this is, again, you mentioned sort of the parallel today where it's like there is a demonization. Do you think this will make people think twice about that, seeing that this has happened in the past, and how will it affect today?
I hope so. So one of the lessons I sort of try to put forward from the book is that we got this misperception about Black power because we weren't really listening properly. And particularly, a lot of the media wasn't really listening to what younger, more radical Black people were saying at the time. They sort of heard something that wasn't really there. And so part of what I hope people get today is that maybe we have been misunderstanding Black Lives Matter because we haven't really been fully listening to the nuance of what they're saying. That they're saying there are some places where white people can be more useful because they're talking to other white people, right? That white people might listen to each other with different ears than they maybe do with Black people. And so I hope we can kind of hear the complexity and the nuance of what is being said.
Was there any concern on your part that in doing this, you would be seen as maybe making an apology for white people's behavior, especially during the civil rights movement and even maybe through today?
Sometimes. I mean, I think there were a lot of things that I was scared of in writing the book. And one was certainly the idea of shining a light back on white people. There's been actually a lot of scholarship that already kind of centers on white people in a Black-led movement, and that's distorted our understanding of the movement. So I was sort of scared of that. I was scared of kind of seen to be a little bit of an apologist, but I try to also think critically about where these white activists aren't kind of living up to their own standards, where they may be falling down on the job. So hopefully people see that when they read the book.
And do they admit that? The folks you talk to say, boy, I wish I had done more or anything like that?
Yeah. I think in particular, they're really critical on themselves, really. And they were really critical on themselves at the time. I think reading through all of their documentation, they criticize themselves and each other relentlessly. And today, they're still really critical on what they did. They say we were too sectarian, sometimes we were too hard on ourselves, but we were brave. I think they have this kind of, whatever benefit time gives them, they're kind of able to look back and sort of see what was really good about what they did and what was also really limiting.
Does this bring you some hope when you look forward, or maybe when you take this and your research to students? How have they responded?
I think so. It's really interesting to show students that that the white past is really more complex than they maybe think it is. And it gives me hope to know that there are these examples we can learn from and try to refit for our time, right? And I think it also gives students this way of seeing how people can change and people can grow and evolve. And that the sort of movement for racial justice has always been multiracial.
It's wonderful to know and interesting to highlight in your new book. The book is Organizing Your Own, The White Fight for Black Power in Detroit. The author is Say Burgin, Assistant Professor of History at Dickinson College. Say, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a real pleasure.
You've been watching the Dickinson College Expert Show. I'm Craig Lane. Thanks so much.